minute.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the monthly Conexxus webinar. And this month we're featuring payment security and risks, controls and processes for securing payment transactions. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. We'll go through a couple housekeeping items. I will provide you with the presenters and their credentials, a little bit about Conexxus. We'll go through the actual presentation, and then we'll go through the Q&A at the end. And now, just would like to remind everybody that this webinar is being recorded. It will be made available in about 30 days. You can find it on YouTube or on the Conexxus.org website. If you complete a very short survey at the end of the presentation, you will receive a link via email that will give you access to the slide deck or the presentation itself. All attendees are on mute, and so therefore we ask that you ask questions via the webinar interface in the question panel. And please no vendor-specific questions. If you do have any other questions or suggestions for webinars, please email info@conexxus.org. Our Conexxus host today is Miss Allie Russell, and she's on the phone with us. I'm your moderator, Cara Gunderson. I'm the chair of the Data Security Committee. I'm also, my day job is the point of sale manager at Citgo Petroleum. Today, we're very honored to have such knowledgeable speakers with us. They are all from the WCAPRA Consulting Group. And it's great to have such folks that focus not only in the payments industry, but also have a very heavy focus on petroleum. So, gentlemen, thank you all for joining us today. We have Terry Mahoney, who's a partner with WCAPRA. Clint Caddy is the director of payments, and then Sam Schieber is the payments consultant. So just a little bit about Conexxus. Conexxus is an independent, nonprofit, member-driven technology organization. They're driven primarily by volunteers such as myself, as well as the gentlemen who are on the phone with us today are also Conexxus members. Conexxus is great because it sets standards for the petroleum industry in the US, for data exchange, data security, and security in general, as well as mobile commerce. And Conexxus provides a vision, and they help identify emerging technology trends. Conexxus also is an advocate for the industry because really technology is a policy. And Conexxus creates standards with a volunteer member-driven organization that allows all of us to utilize the benefits of the Conexxus standards so that all the point-of-sale vendors are using the same Conexxus standards, which helps reduce the amount of development that's required for each of us. We do have another webinar coming up on December 19th. As you can see, there's a list of the previous webinars that we've had this year so far. What's coming up in December is how much you can save with electronic data. And this is being presented by two of our merchants from Conexxus, two of our member merchants. In 2018, coming up in January, we have securing and doing an actual penetration test on your mobile payment app. February, we have a unified threat management. What is it and why is it important? Coming in March, we have an actual penetration test, how to test what matters most. And in May, we have the QIR program update. I'd like to remind everyone that Conexxus holds an annual conference. This year's in Chicago. It'll be held April 29th through May 3rd. If you'd like more information, the Conexxus website has more information. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Terry Mahoney at WCAPRA. Thanks, Terry.
Thanks, Cara. We're going to be talking about risk in, I've been on the Conexxus Data Security Committee for a while, and we typically talk about risk in terms of breaches and PCI compliance. We're taking a more holistic view today to talk about the comprehensive risk to the business related to the payments process and the payments function within your business. So in addition to compliance, we're also going to be touching on ways to reduce the risk of things like fraud losses, reduce the risk of reputational damage, and reduce the risk of missing customer expectations. So in terms of the traditional approach, or what we're calling a minimal approach, obviously you have to be PCI compliant. You implement an AVS and other types of checks, CVV if you're doing e-commerce work, host or local velocity checking, and other types of minimal compliance checking that's required to be able to process payments. We are seeing many merchants, most merchants I would say, move beyond. They're implementing EMV to reduce the risk of accepting payment or counterfeit payment cards. They are implementing encryption and tokenization and doing some other mitigating activities, again, to reduce the risk of fraud occurring. What we're starting to see emerge is a more proactive approach to managing payment risk that includes a lot of the items you see here, but overall, it's a more comprehensive view of what are the risks to the business, in addition to being found not to be compliant, in addition to increased fraud expenditures. There are things like malware that and ransomware. You know, you could get hit with a ransomware attack on all your PIN pads, but then the good news is none of your card data has been compromised. The bad news is you don't have the ability to sell things to customers. So those are the kinds of things that we're seeing, including more comprehensive and near real-time monitoring of key business processes, like number of devices connected, number of sites on the network, number of transactions processed, and correlating those, for example, to like historical trends. If it's a Tuesday in November, right after Thanksgiving, are your transaction volumes, your approval rates, those sorts of things tracking with what you expect them to be? And if not, maybe you need to take a look at what's going on within your environment. So we're going to talk about multiple topics related to accepting a transaction, including the transaction, the three primary questions to consider when accepting it: transaction risk management, some items related to data security and some emerging topics on data security, and we'll touch on operational integrity and the more comprehensive monitoring. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Clint.
Yeah, this is Sam.
Or Sam, I'm sorry.
So yeah, in the last 5 years, payment acceptance and the associated payment technology that enables it has really become increasingly important for merchants, really as a key component of its overall business operations. Advancements have been made in payment technology, and the increase in linkages between payments data and other downstream back office systems has really resulted in a complex environment of hardware, software, and network considerations, which all impact a merchant's entire business, you know, from IT to finance, accounting to operations. These advancements have created new opportunities for introducing risk into the payments process. So it's not enough to only think about managing your payments risk as reducing or minimizing chargebacks. You must consider the entire ecosystem, including transaction risk management, your data security, and the operational integrity and security of your networks. You can really begin to assess your ability or your organization's ability to manage this kind of holistic payments risk by asking yourself these three questions. Should I accept the transaction? How do I protect the transaction details? And how do I secure consumer data and protect my environment? Transaction acceptance decisions are typically the main area of focus for merchants when designing a payments risk management program, and for good reason. Your decision about whether to accept the transaction really is your first line of defense in managing your payments risk. Your transaction acceptance criteria should be specific to the unique needs of your business, and it must include considerations for some of the following factors. So for example, what channels do you operate in? Do you have card present only transactions, card not present only, or are you a mix of both? Do you have any unattended devices? If so, what rules are you putting in place for those devices versus your attended lands? What types of goods do you sell? Do you operate stores in historically high fraud regions in the US? What do the local fraud trends look like in your area? Does this differ across your sites? And then finally, you need to think about kind of how you're balancing the consumer experience against your level of fraud risk tolerance. So are you willing to accept more chargeback risk in favor of a more seamless or quicker checkout experience? Now, these are all factors that need to be considered when you start out designing your transaction acceptance framework and start to define your criteria. And we do want to emphasize that there really is no one size fits all. It really will come down to how you and how your business is structured. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Clint to go into some of the controls that payment system have used to date.
Thanks, Sam. So when we start to take a look at, some of the different payment methods or that we've used today, what we've tried to highlight here on this slide is, we always have had our typical cash for what seems hundreds of years, but we have other payment methods such as ACH, checks, and believe it or not, are still around and are still in use. And then what we're calling our electronic form factors, and we're sort of, combining credit cards, debit cards, stored value, or gift cards. But when we start to look at some of the controls that have been used to date, we start to look at the three main areas of authentication, verification, and authorization. And so we'll go into a little bit deeper detail of each and how that applies to each of these four primary payment methods. So when we look at authentication, we're really talking about the process in which a payment credential is being used to check for its authenticity. Starting in the top left, as we look at cash, right? With cash, we have developed some controls around checking for the presence of anti-counterfeiting design elements. Now, whether that be the security thread in the middle left that runs vertically on a $100 bill, a watermark or color shifting ink, all of those are three different controls that have been implemented. And looking at the bottom left as it relates to authenticity controls around checks, we have some methods such as validating the MICR data encoded on the check, and then referencing the routing number against the financial institution is listed to make sure it's a valid banking institution. Moving over to ACH, we've developed some controls about performing a test deposit, also known as a pre-note or a micro deposit, depending on whether it's to a debit or checking account. And then we have some controls to validate the account in real time using credential-based access to the customer's bank. And looking at the card, obviously, we now look at this as sort of pre-EMV, post-EMV, as most retailers have made the move to accept chip technology. But prior to the implementation of EMV, there were some process controls around checking for the physical card, the brand's logo or hologram, right? If we saw a customer walk in with a blank white card, typically that's probably going to be counterfeit. And then post EMV, we have the automated controls of validating the card's cryptogram or that unique code that is generated with every transaction. The next form around verification, right? And when we speak of verification, we're really talking about the ability to verify that the individual that's initiating the transaction is the account owner or is an authorized user. So when we start to look at verification controls, there really isn't any for cash, right? Someone walks into your location with cash, except for checking to see if it's authentic and making sure it's not counterfeit, you don't know whether that's their cash or not. But as it relates to the other three payment methods, we've developed some verification controls. As it relates to check, right, we can validate the customer's identity either by comparing the name on the check to the name on the driver's license. As it relates to ACH, we can validate the customer's access to credentials again, or we can implement two-factor authentication, either by sending a text message if this is used in a card not present scenario. And then as it relates to using electronic forms of payment with cards, we can look at support of the PIN entry if it's a PIN preferring card in the EMV world. As we all know, this really comes down from what America knows as PIN debit. From a card not present perspective, we do have some controls utilizing CVV, AVS, and 3D Secure, with not many in the US using 3D Secure because of some of its challenges or clunkiness. But as we move to 3D Secure 2.0 in the next 2 to 5 years, hopefully there will be a strong uptick to help with the verification process. Lastly, looking at authorization, right? This is the ability to validate the availability of funds in real time and transfer them to the counterparty in the transaction. This is not talking about real-time payments, right? We all understand that there is a faster payments task force that's underway with the goal of 2020 of having actual real-time. But we've had for years, right? The U.S. is an online infrastructure, so we have been able to, for a number of years, validate those funds to make sure that the account holder actually does have access. Again, looking at cash, this doesn't really apply. They're there in person, so they do have the funds, so there's no real controls in place. Looking at checks, there are some services, right, around funding being made available around the customer's bank via overdraft, even if they have insufficient funds, or some procedural processes of representment of the check by the merchant. Looking at ACH, there are some technology providers that will provide the guarantee of funding, obviously for a service and a fee associated with that service, and then provided that that up to a certain dollar threshold. Again, as I mentioned, as it relates to the card, right, we've been an online infrastructure, right? In real time, we can validate that credit or debit card has available funds.
All right, thanks, Clint. So thinking about what methods that you can use. So really, there's no silver bullet when it comes to managing payment acceptance risk. The organizations that really excel in this area are utilizing a mix of both internal procedures and technology to really assist in that transaction acceptance decision-making process. The methods that we have listed here correspond to the existing controls that we have in the payments process that Clint just covered. So authentication, verification, and authorization. So taking a look at some of the internal procedures that are used, we see the following. So cashier training, really that's kind of the core means to protect the initial transaction acceptance process. And this could really be, training your cashiers to recognize odd behavior or what would look like fraudulent behavior. For example, intentionally triggering fallback on an EMV chip card. So if they see someone putting the card in upside down or backwards, they can instruct the customer on how the card should be inserted. Another internal procedure could be purchase restrictions. So for example, when purchasing a gift card requiring PIN debit. There's also CVV and AVS checks. CVV is no longer collected with EMV, but again, it can still be effective for not present transactions. Taking a look at some technology examples, obviously EMV is a big one that's kind of the top of everyone's mind. This will assist in the authentication and verification process, so allowing you to ensure that that card is legitimate, and with PIN, and as we see PIN hopefully emerge as a preferred CVM, that can also aid in the verification process. Again, technology like 3D Secure, and then right now some real-time transaction scoring. It's rather rudimentary at this stage, but it is improving. And something to think about. This technology continues to improve by leaps and bounds. I think we're going to see the adoption of comprehensive real-time threat assessment tools, and really the rise of shared fraudulent transaction details among merchants that will allow these fraud detection systems to learn and adapt to fight new types of fraud, even fraud that's occurring outside of their organization, by being able to associate these account credentials with these mobile device device fingerprints, things like that, which will allow for kind of the creation of a comprehensive network of fraud fighting tools. So really this technology is advancing rapidly. We're still not all the way there yet. We really think wide scale adoption is still about 1 to 3 years out for these kinds of tools. And then thinking about challenges when implementing transaction acceptance fraud monitoring programs. So really, despite society's best efforts, fraudsters will always be one step ahead of these processes and tools. Fighting fraud is it's like fighting a shape-shifting enemy. Merchants must continue to review, revise, and evolve in order to be successful. Based on our experience of helping merchants, we have seen some transaction acceptance risk management programs suffer due to the following factors. So the first, it's having overly restrictive rules and criteria that results in an increase, and in fact, it could be a sharp increase in the false decline rate. So really there's diminishing returns on the amount of monitoring rules and procedures that you put in place versus the amount of fraud that's prevented. The first few rules that you put in place will, for example, catch the majority of the fraud. Anything after that, the additional tweaking, it's going to be a lot of work, and it's not going to catch as much fraud as some of the wider net rules. I think it's important to acknowledge you won't be able to stop all fraud. Trying to do so, it's only going to result in preventing legitimate transactions, which can be a nightmare for your customer relationship and actually be more damaging than the fraud itself through lost sales and lost customers long term. The next issue that we've seen is implementing so many fraud protection tools that there's increased friction during checkout. So this really could be tools like technology, for example, 3D Secure, or it could even be internal procedures. So if you're utilizing every available tool to fight fraud, your checkout experience is just going to suffer. It's as simple as that. Increased checkout times are going to result in customer frustration and lead to reduced sales through cart abandonment and or reduced customer retention. Customers want to shop at a store that provides a seamless checkout experience. Overall, this really comes back to a point we made on before about striking the balance between the customer experience and your level of risk tolerance. How much risk are you willing to accept for a fast, seamless checkout experience? And finally, the other pitfall that we've observed is the failure to continuously monitor and update your scoring rules and criteria. As we mentioned before, fraud is constantly evolving. Your setup of these rules and these criteria, it really can't be treated as a one-time set it and forget it endeavor. In order to remain effective against new and evolving fraud schemes, your transaction acceptance rules and criteria should be regularly reviewed by your organization. And this review should include a cross-functional group of representatives from all aspects of the business, including IT, finance and accounting, and store operations. It's really important that all voices are heard in these decisions, just because payments, as we've seen, it's not just an IT endeavor. It really does touch all aspects of the business. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Clint.
Thanks, Sam. And going back to the first slide where we had the basic, the moderate, the proactive, When we start to look at sort of protecting transactions, this is something that, really relates coming down to encryption and tokenization. This is not something that's not new in the payments industry. However, we're still not all the way there. What we're trying to highlight here is this is an example of possible encryption and tokenization. There are a number of different ways that encryption and tokenization can be implemented, right? This can be used using third-party encryption and tokenization services. This could be using your acquire-based encryption tokenization services. We're moving towards network-based tokenization services. But what we're trying to show is, at the end of the day, we're trying to stop fraud, and we're trying to stop the bad guys from getting in the door, because once they're in, right, we all know, we read headlines on everything that happens, and whether it's Equifax or whether it's Uber, just the most recent, but we take the approach that it's not if a company gets hacked, it's when a company gets breached. And so if we know that that is going to happen, or we think that's going to happen, making sure that that data is absolutely useless to whoever steals it helps protect that brand reputation. Obviously, there will be some fallout, but as long as a CEO or a CIO can actually say, yes, we were breached, but nothing of value was stolen. That's extremely powerful to help with the brand reputation. Another thing that I'd like to highlight here is, I said encryption and tokenization has been, a mainstay for a couple of years within the payments industry, and many retailers have implemented these types of services. I will say, as it relates to the petroleum industry, we're still not all the way there. We're still trying to figure out how to do application layer encryption at the forecourt, with only a minimal amount of product offerings out there today, right? Trying to figure out how to handle fleet card restrictions is something that is still underway. So while we're making good strides, I think it's good to point out that, there's still some work left to do as it relates to helping protect transactional data.
So the bad news is there are literally tens of thousands of bad guys out there who wake up every morning. They don't go to work. Their idea of going to work is to go out and steal your data and your customers' data. So that, and it's a vertically integrated industry. If you read some of the stuff about what's going on the dark web, there are people who specialize in, for example, they specialize in making skimmers. Other people specialize in planting skimmers. Other people specialize in exfiltrating the data, and other people monetize that data. So and they all have business relationships, probably not a lot of contracts involved. But so the bad news is that we are under attack. And as Clint mentioned, it's basically, there are two types of companies: those that know they've been attacked and those that don't know they've been attacked. The technology changes that are coming out and that are going to be required to meet continually evolving business requirements and customer expectations are going to make the security aspects more difficult. Things like IoT, Wi-Fi that's both consumer-facing plus Wi-Fi devices that we have for true business applications. And of course, the whole plethora of cloud-based services. Connectivity is great in that you get real-time access to data, but connectivity inherently involves risks. So, basically, that's the world we're going to be living in. So, how do we counter the security risks? It's basically through a whole range of techniques: defense in depth and proactive monitoring of the security, and as I mentioned, proactive monitoring of the overall integrity of your business operations. Okay, so for network security, IDS and IPS are key technologies that many retailers have implemented It's the intrusion detection as well as the intrusion prevention. I will say we do a lot of data security consulting, and we have a whole data security practice. One of the key areas that needs to be where we see retailers not paying enough attention. You can implement these systems, but you still need the operational processes around what to do when you detect an intrusion, what to do when you detect a pattern of network traffic that indicates there might be an attempted intrusion. So those intrusion, the business processes and the operational processes to react to IDS IPS alerts or unified threat management. I know we have another webinar coming up in the next few months, UTM alerts and other security systems. Please, one of my key recommendations is make sure you understand what you're going to do, who's going to do it, where all that information is going to be recorded, and if you need reinforcement, where you're going to go for that reinforcement. Another technology that can help a lot is software-defined networking. And there's a lot of things that call themselves software-defined networking, but basically it's making sure you don't need to send a servicer out. You can alter the behavior, alter the security rules, alter the allowable paths on your network programmatically, remotely, and it doesn't matter what hardware you have in some cases. If you can implement a true SDN that can deal with a lot of different site level hardware configurations and LAN configurations. Again, the key benefit here is your ability to adapt to emerging threats. So for example, one real world example, we have a client who has a food service offer. They implemented payment on tablets for queue busting, and I think everybody's familiar with that use case. And of course, they're using WPA2 on their Wi-Fi networks, and nobody was concerned about WPA2 having a security flaw in it. And lo and behold, last month it was detected, and it got a lot of high-level publicity. In that case, of course, their tablet payment application was encrypted at the application level. They were using TLS 1.2 for their payment traffic. So that level of defense in depth helped them out. So defense in depth is something you need to make sure your business stakeholders understand, because of like the example I just mentioned with WPA2 getting correct. So you have site applications that are talking to host applications through a set of infrastructure. So our recommendation is, the best practice is making sure you have encryption at multiple layers. So you encrypt the transport between your sites and a network hub or a network appliance if you're doing VPNs directly to the third-party servicers or to your data center. That keeps that traffic encrypted at that level. Okay. At the software layer, there's typically the encryption approach is, there are some ones that are specific to applications, but typically you see things like TLS 1.2, whether it's SSL, SFTP, or HTTPS. That encryption provides it at the application layer in case the transport layer gets breached. And we have seen implementations and where people do things like where clients of ours have implemented, they need to move files securely, and one example that I can think of, it was actually PII data, not necessarily payment data, where they encrypt the files, they send those encrypted files through a TLS 1.2 application session over a AES 256 VPN. Now that may sound like a lot of overkill, and you may get pushback from your business stakeholders on what is this all costing me, but the good news is many of the applications and a lot of the infrastructure components already implement those types of encryption, and including interoperable encryption approaches. And the incremental cost isn't much to add on those additional layers of security. The last point I'm going to talk about is operational integrity, and this is the point I alluded to earlier, which is beyond securing the data, beyond making sure that the site is up. It's making sure that your consumer payments, your critical operational processes, everything is performing according to expected metrics. And the analogy I would use here is process control. We do refining work also. And it's very similar if you've ever worked on either manufacturing or refining process control, where you have expected data volumes, expected approval rates, expected number of sites connected, expected transaction mix. And you measure all of that in near real time and make sure that it's operating, that your business is operating within expected values. Okay. So that overall comprehensive approach to building reliable operations includes making sure you have the processes in place for monitoring, alerting, you have control limits. So for example, if you're expecting 98.5% approvals on your credit card transactions and 92% approvals on debit card transactions, you may want to give it a little wiggle room, but we have helped clients implement systems that paid for themselves because, you know, suddenly the approval rates on one particular card type dropped from 98.5 down to 85. And they alerted on it, and lo and behold, there was a configuration change. It wasn't a software change, it wasn't a network change, just a minor configuration change, what they thought was a minor configuration change that resulted in a lot of false declines. They were able to recognize it quickly and correct that configuration change. That leads to, on the lower left here, the response plan and procedures. Make sure that when you implement something for monitoring, for doing these metrics around these critical business and operational processes, that you know how it's going to be detected, who's going to notice it, who they're going to notify, and how that team gets assembled to address it, to assess it, and then address it. Again, as you go through, this is not a one-time activity. This is something where continuous improvement and continuous learning definitely applies. And I would include that both on the operational integrity side and on the network security for like the IDS, IPS, UTM type stuff. That the threats are continually evolving, the risks to the business are continually evolving. So as you monitor, as you measure, as you observe different patterns going on within your business operation, make sure your monitoring systems are continually updated in terms of their logic to continually detect new and emerging threats. Okay, that's our piece.
Great.
Okay, Kara, back to you.
Well, thanks, gentlemen. Thank you very much for sharing such great information and sharing your knowledge of the payments industry. I think that's pretty indicative of the information that you shared today. And I would like to remind everybody that to please use the question panel in the webinar panel section of your screen to ask questions. And while you're busy doing that, we did have one question that came up, and this was during Clint's section. And Clint, when you reference authentication and verification of the cash, check, card, and ACH methods, the question was, what is the percentage of sales that pay via card compared to the other three payment types, which are cash, check, and ACH? Do you have any stats off the top of your head?
I have some general ones. This really comes down to the industry that you're in. For example, If you look at ACH is used in a much higher percentage as it relates to things like subscription services, where I'm having a fee hit my directly to my banking account once a month, once a quarter, once a year. If you look at just in general cards, I would say probably make up around 65% of the business. Cash, right? Obviously, if you're a CNP merchant only, you don't accept cash. But looking at general retail, probably around 25 to 35%. I'd say checks are the ones that are at the small end. They're actually still used. There's actually a lot of volume. We see that more. I mean, you typically think about it. Where do you see most checks? I typically see them mostly in the grocery store, where people have used checks for a long time. But again, varies by industry, but those are some general statistics.
Great. Thank you for that. We had another question come in. Do any of you happen to know the current U.S. fraud rates on credit card pay at the pump transactions? Like the percentage of fraud to sales ratio?
The number that jumps to mind, and it jumps to mind because it's a scary number, is that worldwide payment card fraud is a $17 billion a year industry. Now that includes card not present as well as card present. Allie, I don't know if NACS has any industry statistics for petroleum and convenience. I know I have some data, but I can't share it because most retailers consider that very close hold type information, what their fraud rates are.
Sure. And a lot of that too is dictated, would you say it's dictated by location and geography as well?
Absolutely, right? Just as we're seeing most counterfeit fraud in areas along the borders, right, in major metropolitan areas, I mean, fraud rates, just fraud at the pump also follows that same general trend.
Yep, and another one that comes to mind is if you're on an interstate corridor, that type of thing is also pretty high fraud rates as well.
Exactly.
Right.
We do have another question is, are you seeing customers understanding and adopting network segmentation techniques as a layer of security?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a needed to play, what we're seeing. And most of the managed service vendors can do that and can manage that network segmentation layer. Making sure you define those layers correctly is key, because we work in a rather, our industry is a little unique in that for many of the retailers, they have multiple channels of trade, so the amount of control they have over site devices varies. In some, there's rigorous controls because they're all company operated sites, and others operate franchise channels and dealer channels and jobber channels. So the land segmentation approach has to account for that reality, not just obviously any retailer today is going to have internet access to the site so they can do online ordering with a number of their merchandise suppliers and get their settlement reports from the payment processing portal. So you have internet facing traffic and then you have payments traffic, and you don't want those two to mix. The other thing is, depending upon your channel of trade, the land segmentation approach, or the channels of trade, I should say, the land segmentation approach needs to be able to recognize when suspicious devices might have been plugged into one of those land segments. Clint, anything to add from your perspective?
No, I think you hit on it. I think it's absolutely a thing that becomes sort of standard operating procedure. Many companies have invested in security specialists and network specialists so that they can segment off not just PCI data, right? That started, a number of years ago, but segmenting off just particular areas of the business, so that in the event of a data breach, that a hacker cannot jump from one area to the next. But it's absolutely a standard part of doing business today.
Great.
One thing to build on Clint's point.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay, one thing to build on Clint's point is that we've focused on payment because that's the data that's probably the most monetizable in our industry, and it's the area where you're most likely to be attacked. There are two other data types that we should mention. Obviously, PII data. If you're, we've worked with clients who are doing like real-time loyalty registration from a kiosk at their retail site, or they have employee data that goes up. You need to make sure, unlike PCI, that the requirements around PII are mixed. It's a more confusing area, but it can cause financial damage as well as reputational damage if you have a PII breach. The other one, which is an emerging fraud area, is loyalty data. And we do know of instances where loyalty data was stolen, and the bad guys were able to monetize those loyalty points to buy things that they could go sell on eBay. And so just because it's loyalty and not payment data, you need to think about the risk associated with that, ways to mitigate it, and ways to protect that data either at your site or while it's in transit.
Yeah, any data that's of value is potentially at risk.
Right.
I mean, and there's industry reports that are out there that even show that, right? Stealing an email, a name, address, stealing actually the PII data is actually worth more now on the black web than it is, or dark web, or whatever we want to call it, than it is stealing a credit card number, right? Because if I can go set up an account and then, or take over your bank account, then I can do a lot more than just what I could do by stealing your credit card. So credit card is definitely the most in mass that's being stolen. And that's what the bad guys have typically targeted, but it actually has a lower value on the street these days.
Great. We did have one last question here, and it's around mobile payment processors. And do you gentlemen have much experience with working with the third-party mobile payment processors? And if yes, what kind of, have you seen them, I guess, sort of up their game for data security?
So when I'm going to take it in two parts, because I think, are we talking about third-party mobile application companies that help develop the mobile app, or are we talking about that they help provide a gateway service that can then integrate to an acquire from a mobile application for payments? I think we're asking about the latter.
I would agree.
We do. We have seen them step up their game. There are many more integrations that were available prior to a couple years ago. But I mean, I think that everyone in our industry knows that every year since 2012 has been the year of mobile. I don't think it was in 2012, but I do think they have. I still think as it relates to mobile applications themselves, they are still highly the most vulnerable compared to looking at e-commerce sites. And I think that that's where a lot of the fraudsters are targeting and how they can exploit those. But as it relates to the processing, yes, we've seen them sort of step up their game.
Great.
Yeah, but I would, building on what Clint said, is it's an area where I have seen retailers say, well, it's a mobile developer, you know, they've got to pass all the Apple checks in order to get something up on iTunes. Well, that's true, but we have seen mobile implementations of both mobile apps and mobile platforms where prior to implementation, some security won't call them. Well, don't assume it's a mobile app that the mobile app and the mobile platform meets all of your security requirements. It will meet it'll be over in the minimal thing, but it's worth a conversation, a structured conversation to say, let's go through all of the different aspects of security in this new mobile implementation, both for the device and the platform that's going to be processing your payment and loyalty transactions. And let's do a comprehensive data security review. That is, I would highly recommend that based on firsthand experience.
And that's a great segue to featuring our January webinar, which is about mobile payment security. So, and the mobile payment app. So, all right. Well, gentlemen, thanks again for your time, and would like to remind everybody if they would please complete the short survey following the end of this webinar, then you will receive a copy of the presentation or email link to get a copy of the presentation. And if you do have any questions, please visit us at conexxus.org or send questions or inquiries to info@conexxus.org. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.